Hello, everybody. Peter Maravellis here, and on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers, and our partners here at Gray Area, as well as our friends over at Yale University Press, I'd like to welcome you to an evening of discussion with two really great thinkers. We are celebrating tonight the launch of the fantastic and important new book titled Atlas of AI, Power, Politics, and the Planetary Costs of Artificial Intelligence. It's authored by Kate Crawford and published by Yale University Press. Before we begin, I would like to bring attention to the good work of Gray Area, our co-presenter and producer of tonight's event. Gray Area is a cultural center and educational hub located in San Francisco's Mission District. Their mission is to apply art and technology to create social and civic impact through education, incubation, and public events. They use digital tools to create art and design projects that benefit society. To learn more about their calendar of events, their workshops, please visit grayarea.org. I'd like to also take this moment to thank Nadav, Tiffany, and Matthew, and the rest of the gang at Gray Area for all their good work. It's been a great pleasure working with them in the past, and City Lights is thrilled to be working with them once again. I'd also like to thank our partners at Yale University Press. In particular, Liz Pelton, we've worked with for many, many years for all her efforts in making tonight's event happen. Thank you, Liz. Since its inception, City Lights has always encouraged the concept of deep inquiry, from the books that we stock and publish through to the event programs that we develop. As we move forward, the aim of exploring technology and its effects on culture becomes ever more important for us. Every aspect of living has become intertwined with systems that are increasingly complex and becoming invasive to our lives. The deepening of discourse around technology becomes essential to foster and maintain an informed citizenry. We need to be able to respond to the challenges posed to democratic and humanist principles with inquisitiveness and creativity. And generating ideas to encourage civic responsibility and involvement is at the heart of the City Lights mission. Kate Crawford's writing and thought go a long way in opening our eyes to the high stakes involved in the rapid and reckless technological expansion that's accelerating all around us. The Atlas of AI eloquently explores the fine threads of AI through its history, mythologies, and its political collisions, using AI as a kind of a dark mirror with which we can better see what is happening all around us. Peter Gallison, the author of Einstein's Clocks, likened AI to a kind of ghost that haunts the world's machines. He also goes on to credit the Atlas of AI as, quote, making the ghost of AI visible. I think that really beautifully captures what's at the heart of Kate's work and the Atlas. Atlas of AI is a multi-layered, erudite, at times wonderfully weird, and brutally honest exploration of the subject, and we are delighted and honored to be able to host this conversation. A bit of background is in order for our speakers before we begin. Kate Crawford is one of the world's leading scholars of the social and political implications of artificial intelligence. She is a research professor at ASC Annenberg, a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research, and the inaugural chair of AI and Justice at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Joining her tonight in conversation is the fabulous Trevor Paglen. Trevor is no stranger to City Lights. We hosted him all the way back in his Torture Taxi and Blank Spot days and have been championing his work ever since. He's an award-winning artist and geographer who explores and documents invisible infrastructures ranging from secret corporate and government sites to networks known through technologies of non-human machine vision. His art practice and thinking spans through image making, sculpture, investigative journalism, writing, engineering, filmmaking, and a variety of other disciplines. He's won an Academy Award for Best Director and Camera Work for the documentary film Citizen4. He's had numerous exhibitions of his art featured at museums around the world. One of the most amazing exhibits took place in Fukushima after the meltdown of the reactor in collaboration with the Japanese collective Chim Palm. It was called Don't Follow the Wind, and Trevor's part in the exhibit was comprised of radioactive elements encased in a cube of glass and displayed in a warehouse exhibit that could only be visited virtually. So Trevor is well known for his trailblazing creativity, and it is a great honor to be back in his orbit once again. There's going to be a Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please post your questions like in the chat function. I'd like to encourage everyone, please do buy a book tonight and through City Lights. We're going to be posting links in the chat function. Gray Area has also posted the link on its event description. Help support programming like this and these wonderful collaborations with our local partners. Each book you buy really does go a long way in supporting all of our efforts. So without much more ado, Kate Crawford, Trevor Paglen, welcome to City Lights at Gray Area.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that incredible introduction. That was a tour de force. Hi, Trevor. Great to see you.
Hi, Kate. How are you?
You know, keeping on. What is it? We're all pandemic okay. You know, that's what we can say. How are you doing?
It's good. Things are starting to feel a little bit better. I'm in New York, and you know, it's mellowing out, and it's kind of summer's on the way. But we are not here to talk about that today. We're here to talk about your amazing book that that is being very appropriately lauded as something, you know, groundbreaking and really just an enormous contribution, not only to the kind of specific fields and ways that we think about technology, but to kind of nonfiction itself and kind of how to approach really big questions. And so it's just huge congratulations. I'm so happy to see the book is out. I'm so happy to see it just being praised with all the energy and you know, excitement that it deserves. And yeah, everybody, to reiterate, everybody buy the book, buy it from City Lights, buy it now. You won't be disappointed. It truly is remarkable and extraordinary, as is the work that you've done to realize this book, not only obviously in terms of the writing, but in terms of this bigger intellectual project that you've been involved with for quite a long time. And I think you and a really small handful of people have really changed the way that a lot of us and in a lot of popular discourse around technology and around machine learning and around, you know, what we used to call big data and artificial intelligence and what have you. And you were really a very early critical voice in a field that was doing social engineering and was doing political engineering, but was pretending that they were doing math and was pretending that they were, you know, at best building these, you know, democratic spaces where you could use Google Docs for free and, you know, do Facebook for free and that sort of thing. And for a very long time, you've been someone saying, hold up, slow down, not so much. Let's take a closer look at this. And now with this really remarkable book, you've taken a really kind of interesting conceptual framing to the question of what is AI, how do we think about it, what are the issues at stake when we think about it, and it's come together in this form that you call an atlas. Now, I would never have think about, an atlas having anything to do with AI. I would think about some kind of brain in a computer or something like that. But why an atlas? How did you arrive at this point?
Well, I mean, you know, it's interesting because I know that this is something that you and I have discussed for many years, is the way that artificial intelligence tends to be represented is as this very abstract, ethereal, in the cloud set of mathematical formulations and algorithms, very separate from any kind of earthly or material concerns. And I think that's been a real trap, that we have lost touch with understanding the true costs of this very large extractive industry. And in many ways, I think AI has become the extractive industry of the 21st century. So what I wanted to do to try and understand that and then share it with people was to really sort of bring AI back to earth, to really ground it. And that means sort of putting it in a context where we can see it at different scales. And for me, atlases are really unusual types of books. They allow you to look at the scale of a continent, or you can zoom in and you can look at a mountain range or a city. And that way of shifting scales seems to be like a really good metaphor for how we need to look at the different ways in which AI is now starting to impact the way we live at so many different levels, personally with our devices, but also in our workplaces, in our schools, and also at the level of nation states. So in that sense, I think an atlas is very useful, but obviously there's another sense too, which is that atlases are documents of colonial lines of power and domination. So I think we need a theory of AI that really contends with the corporations and the states that are driving it, with the types of extractions from the earth and natural resources to actually build planetary scale computation. And then finally, to trace all of the forms of labor that are exploited along the supply chains of large scale technical infrastructures. So in that sense, for me, sort of really creating a territory, sort of really putting AI in place where we can go to sites and see how it is made. That was really the objective of the book.
And it's certainly there. I mean, one of the things that's so great about it is that it's almost like geomorphic atlases and human atlases and economic atlases, and you're using all of these not only conceptual framings, but actual flows of finance, flows of lithium to make batteries, flows of labor, flows of photons, what have you, across the world, and looking at the construction of these incredibly huge planetary scale systems that are at once technical, but also political, social, cultural, economic, like even geomorphic, right? Yeah. it We were in Berlin a few years ago during the summer, I think, and you at that time were working on a project with Vladen Joler, the artist, that would end up being called an anatomy of AI. And I don't know if you think about anatomy of AI as being a kind of small scale version of this, or this being a larger scale version of anatomy, but these projects seem very related to each other. You want to talk a little bit about that project and how it got you maybe inspired to think about AI in this way, or at least communicate it to other people?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because in terms of thinking about the genesis of Atlas of AI, I really rate that as one of the projects that changed my thinking as a researcher and really changed the way I saw AI. It started way back in 2016 when Vladan and I were actually at a conference on voice-enabled AI, and we thought, okay, well, how does that actually work? How do you speak to something like an Amazon Echo and it actually responds to you if you say, hey, buy some more toilet paper, and it actually does that for you? What is that process? And so we ended up getting a big piece of butcher's paper and basically sketching out that sort of data pipeline, which we kind of understood at a pretty high level in terms of how that works. But then we realized that was not enough. To really understand how that cylinder can do that work, you have to open it up. You have to look at the components. Then you have to understand where they come from. And then suddenly we found ourselves studying basically the mining supply paths in terms of where are these components coming from? Where are they being pulled from the earth? What are the labor practices there? Then what happens in terms of smelting and manufacturing and distribution? What happens with container shipping before you even get to the data pipelines? And then we went all the way through to the end of life to look at what happens when these devices get thrown out, which generally is somewhere between 3 to 4 years. It's a split second of technological time that has really been created out of minerals that are billions of years in development. So that sort of shift in timescale for this tiny moment of convenience was an extraordinary thing to really look at. So that project was much harder than either of us expected it would be, because you have to research in so many directions and so many different fields. And it was in doing that I realized, we've done this big project looking at a single Amazon Echo. What happens if I broaden that out to look at the entire AI industry? And so that was the motivation for doing Atlas of AI. And in the same way, I mean, these are projects that sort of do force you to sort of think in very different ways. You need to look economically, you need to look geomorphically, you need to look socially and politically. But that sense of bringing different ways of seeing, I think has been so important, because we are in many ways taught not to see, not to look at our technical systems, to leave them in the background and to let them fade away. And I think that is a dangerous political choice at this moment.
Yeah, and I think what is so powerful about the kind of style of research and style of thinking that you're bringing to the atlas and to this project is one that really is thinking about nature, culture, technology, politics, economics, we call sociopolitical forces as being very blurry, where the distinctions are between those things. And it's such a useful way to think about technology, because so often you think about, oh, technology, it's just tools, or it's just this neutral kind of clean stuff that happens, in the cloud, which, who knows where that is. And it then doesn't have the same kind of ecological footprint as an auto industry or as a coal industry, when in fact to build an AI model, it requires burning a bunch of coal. I think my friend the artist Hito Steyerl once gave a talk where she was looking at how much energy it costs to stream a Netflix film. Right. And you can make a relation to this many trees had to get burned up to stream that film, for example. Is a really powerful way of thinking. And having said that, though, there are particular things that have to do with the contemporary moment in AI and the kind of machine learning revolution. There is something that happened in the world of math and algorithms and that sort of thing, which my understanding happens around the late aughts, where that had to do with the ability to collect huge amounts of data and do stuff with it. And that was at the time, something that you were on it already and thinking about what was that. Do you want to talk I think you have a chapter in your book that's looking at just the politics of collecting data and the politics of data in the first place.
Mm. You're absolutely right that, there's been a real shift, and you can trace that at various points. You could certainly go back to the turn in the early 2000s, where computational storage is really expanding and getting cheaper, and the ability to simply just harvest so much off the internet, images, text, video, you name it, and to use that as almost like the training substrate of how we teach technical systems. And I use teach in a very loose sense here, to understand and represent the world. Now, one of the things that I found really interesting in doing this book was to try and find, where did that sort of idea come from, that you understand the world simply by collecting a whole set of data and then using that as ground truth, rather than looking at the ways in which that might be leaving a lot out, or producing particular skews, historical ways of seeing, prejudices, biases that will then be baked into technical systems. Where did that idea come from? And certainly you can go back to a shift that was happening in the 1970s and 80s, the move away from traditional forms of symbolic logic, an idea of expert systems for technical AI, where it would be trying to essentially model human ways of speaking or recognizing objects, to essentially doing something more like a probabilistic approach, brute force tests of just huge amounts of data. That there are some extraordinary examples. I'm thinking here of the sort of media historian Xiaoqing Li at Stanford, who did this study looking at IBM's continuous speech recognition lab. And that shift where they said, we don't really need to understand what words mean. We just need to have a huge amount of data and just to see pattern recognition. That idea that suddenly more data was better, no matter what. And it sort of created the shift towards essentially just not thinking about context or meaning of data or particularities, but to just see it as an infrastructure en masse, where all of its meaning drops away. And the most important thing is just scale. So that scalar moment has really been so significant in how machine learning works today, the sort of most recent phase of AI. And it brings with it, sort of freighted along with it, I think, a very specific type of politics and a very specific set of historical ways of seeing and speaking that are rarely thought of as such. They're seen as somehow objective or neutral, when of course nothing could be further from the truth. So, and this is something I know you've thought a lot about, Trevor, because, you're unusual in that you're an artist who has also built and designed AI systems to try and reflect on how they work and where they fail. So I'm curious in your experience of doing that. I mean, we've collaborated on projects where we've sort of tried to kind of look at the logics of training sets. I'm curious where you start to see those politics emerge in the way that machine learning works today.
Well, I mean, for me, trying like understanding how machine learning systems work has been super, super interesting, particularly when we look at computer vision, because it's so bizarre. And, the underlying theory of vision or the underlying theory of knowledge is so weird that it takes you a long time to learn how one can even think using those forms of statistical methods. And there's someone who works in my studio named Leaf who builds a lot of the software for us and a lot of the machine learning models. And he always jokes, he's like, machine learning and artificial intelligence, otherwise known as algebra. And the joke is that this is actually this is super basic stuff, but you can do extraordinary things with statistics, right? And you can learn how to quote unquote recognize objects with computer vision systems by doing a statistical analysis of different kinds of images. So there are remarkable things that you can do with it, but in order to kind of create that data layer, to make that layer of this is intelligible data that we are going to input into the machine learning system, you need to create the data in a way. You need to collect, you need to have some stuff, and then you need to categorize that stuff. And you have to say, this is some stuff, this is what that stuff means. And then you can feed that into a machine learning system that will do a statistical analysis and look for the classification that you're attributing to something through a whole pile or a whole world of data that's piled up. And so to me, and this is something we've talked about a ton, is how do you go from a kind of infinitely complex and frothing and buzzing and world to a set of discrete categories that you are going to use to describe that world, or that you're going to ascribe to that world.
Right.
And there's a politics to that. And there's a politics to that in the abstract, and then there's a specific politics to that in different kinds of data sets, right? And this is something that you think a lot about in the book. You have a whole chapter on the politics of classification. So what are some of the kinds of classifications that you talk about in the book and that you see going on here?
Yeah, I mean, there are some really kind of clear ones that you can see in so many sort of training sets for machine learning, where there are categories for gender, for example, which are binary, you have male and female. So
pictures of just people scraped from the internet. They'll be like, here's a bunch of pictures of like women, and here's a bunch of pictures of
categories. Like, and again, like that idea of ascribing identity to people, imposing identity on them. And then again, you see this similarly with race. There are systems where you have like 4 categories of race, from like white, black, Indian, Asian, and then sometimes a bonus category for other. And I mean, and the histories of these sorts of extraordinarily problematic classifications haven't been thought through. They've simply been imported into ways of technical seeing. And it's funny, I think about Simone Brown's point that she makes about the way in which we've been just assuming that we can use technical systems to assign identity to people without thinking about the legacies that's invoking and what sorts of futures we're building. And that's at sort of the high level. But one of the things that I've enjoyed working together with you, Trevor, is that you can go way levels below that. People have been categorized in all sorts of ways, in terms of their appearance, in terms of their productivity, in terms of their morality. When we spent a couple of years looking at ImageNet and all of the categories that sort of populate there, some of them are just really strange. You know, you've got categories for debtor. Like, what does it mean to scrape pictures off the internet and say this person looks like, you know, their bank account is in the red?
You want to describe what ImageNet is? Because I think it's a good one
let's talk
for it
about
to
it.
like let people know about.
Yeah. So Trevor, knock yourself out.
You want me to describe?
Do it. Tell us about ImageNet.
So, I mean, ImageNet is a data set made primarily for computer vision applications that was created at Stanford in between 2009 and 2011. And the idea was, in the words of the authors, to make a complete, you know, database of all the objects in the world, right? So
They
to
use the word
map
map, actually. They said
to
to
map
map
out the
entire
entirety
world.
of the objects in the world, or something like that is the quote.
That was it.
So,
Yeah.
so it's this huge database basically of images. It's about 14 million images organized into 20,000 something categories. And it just goes on and on. It's things like apple, applesauce, apple fritter, apple jacks, you know, but so it's just almost, this is a Borgesian, you know, collection of labels and images, right? So of images that have been put into these different labeled pots. And you know, it gets pretty gnarly sometimes, you know, as you know, like there's a lot of these pots that are of classifications of people. So you mentioned, you know, there's ones like man, woman, but the further and further in the database you get, the weirder and weirder it gets. You do start finding things like man, women, cheerleader, Boy Scout, you know, debtor, you know, and then it, you know, gets even crazier and more offensive from there. But and it does come back to what you were talking about earlier with the idea of an atlas invoking particular ways of seeing, you know, in particular like politics of classification that have histories to them. And these are very often imperial histories or policing histories. You know, if you have a category of a person like a debtor, that's not something that like exists in nature. That's an entirely historical and political construct. And I think you see this kind of confusion over and over again when you look at training sets. Is so often they're not so much describing a world so much as creating a world in the vision, you know, in the vision of the people building the system. Would you agree with that?
No, I think that's exactly right. And often that's quite explicit. I mean, again, the idea of using this operating metaphor of an atlas of AI is really also pointing to the way in which AI itself is making an atlas of the world, although it is trying to be the centralized singular atlas, the singular way of seeing. And, you know, that's something that I'm really trying to work against in this book. Like, what do we lose when we come up with these very centralized ways of understanding each other, the world, and everything in between? And that's something that also has a history. I mean, if we go back to, you know, some of the sort of earliest figures in the history of AI, people like Woody Bledsoe, who was one of the first people to really start experimenting with facial recognition, a deeply problematic technology in itself. But he described AI as being the only science, you know, and commonly in textbooks, you know, AI is described as the universal way of understanding the world. I mean, it really is becoming this extraordinarily powerful sort of centralized set of tools where they're just seen as somehow tools that can be used without bringing these kinds of problematics along with them. So I think really, so basically trying to kind of open that up is both a technical task, which is something that, you know, that we've done by creating systems, looking at how they work, looking at their classifications, but it's also a political task. We need to step back. We need to look at, well, who are these systems built to serve? You know, who can afford them, who can deploy them? And more you start to see that commonly they serve the dominant interests. And this is how we can start to see AI itself as a registry of power, as a registry of serving the interests of those who would need large-scale surveillance, large-scale classification, large-scale systems of credit worthiness and modulating people's activities over time. So I think this is, you know, definitely a concern that both you and I share in our work, is what happens when those tools are applied to existing structures of power. And that is why it's so important that we put them in these broader contexts.
I think that's a super, and that's something that I think is really a huge contribution that the book and your thinking in general has made, within the industry as well as within the world at large. There's so much, in some ways you help really instigate this conversation about like bias in AI, but then as soon as that caught hold, you immediately complicated that with the very now famous talk that you gave at what was then called the NIPS conference, you know what I mean? Where you kind of problematize the idea of bias in AI. And you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I think that was such an important contribution to the conversation that you've really built out a lot in this book as well.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, when I started doing this work over 10 years ago now, it was very clear to me that this problem of importing structural ways of seeing was evident. And even in the early days, people would say things like, oh, well, you kind of have bias in large scale data. The more data you have, the less bias it becomes. And that was really an article of faith, certainly in the industry. And what we've seen, of course, is the opposite of that. What we've seen over the last few years is profusion of systems that produce forms of discrimination along lines of race, gender, ability, you name it. It's extraordinary how many examples we have, from Compass to Apple's creditworthiness algorithms to facial recognition systems that don't see women with darker skin tones to voice recognition systems that don't hear female sounding voices. I mean, the list is endless. And what I saw, which concerned me, was that the response to this was, well, thanks for pointing that out. We'll just, get rid of a problematic label, or we will just, slightly technically tweak our system, or we'll harvest more data so that we can recognize more sorts of faces. That to me is the way in which we're seeing a capture of these systems as always having to be deployed. Rather than seeing an error and saying, no, this is a fundamental question, there was a desire to produce a type of almost band-aid response of technical fixes, so that when, Google's image labeling service was imaging sort of people who, had darker skin tones as gorillas, that was obviously so problematic around how it works. And of course, what they did was they just removed the gorilla label. And it's like, well, that is actually not addressing the core problem that's emerging here. And so, the reason that I started to sort of give talks at technical conferences like what is now called NeurIPS, several years ago, was to say we have to look at these grounding classificatory logics, and we have to ask, why are these systems doing what they're doing, and in service of whom? And then I think we actually have to move away from bias, which is such a narrow term, to start to say, what are the politics of classification here, and what are these issues of power? So, certainly that's something that I've been writing and speaking about for a long time. But I think for this book, I wanted to do something different, to take it a step further, to say, how do we actually see those systems being built in the world? And what that meant that I had to do is I had to put myself in the picture. I had to actually go to the places where, for example, training sets are being constructed, to go to archives where you see these sorts of logics of classification emerge, to go to mines, to go and see where sort of lithium crystal is being drawn out of the earth, and to go to places of where we're starting to see sort of hybrid forms of automated work with robots and people and algorithmic management, places like Amazon fulfillment centers. So for me, tracing those histories is really about moving away from this narrow technical focus on, technically, how do we remediate bias, to let us look at this entire system and to see what is actually happening, where these extractions are occurring, where these classificatory practices are occurring, and then who pays, who benefits and who pays. Because when we put it in terms so stark, you can actually see and trace those planetary costs now and over time.
I mean, I can't help but read your book through a kind of geographic lens, which is one of my things that I'm trained in. And one of the things that there is another kind of spatiality, I guess, that I see underlying the atlas. On one hand, you are talking about, you are going to the mines, and you are going and looking at the skulls, and you are looking at the the tendrils that AI systems have from, philosophical and epistemological concepts into the earth and into coal mines and into lithium mines and what have you. But you also, I see another aspect to this, with spatial aspect to this, that I think about as being akin to a kind of enclosure, which is that as the devices that we use and as the kind of technical systems surrounding us become more and more woven into the more intimate parts of our everyday lives, they are bringing that extractive logic to places where capital and where the police in earlier times would have had a really difficult time getting to, right? That would be that you open up all these new sites of extraction that before would have been far too inefficient for anybody to be interested in. For example, you would go to sleep with your Fitbit, and now so a company is measuring how many hours of sleep did you get and can monetize that and sell that information to an insurance company or to a talent scout or an employer or what have you. You have cars installed with cameras that can use AI to monitor, whether or not you're texting while driving or whether you look sleepy and modulate your insurance rates based on that. To me, there's something about, there is a kind of invasion of what were previously more private spaces and a kind of extraction from them. Am I right in saying that that's one of the kind of implicit arguments in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I would go further and say it's an explicit argument. It's to look at what I think of as a far more granular form of capture and control. I mean, you can see it. You can see it all along the sort of current systems that you can really just get off the shelf that anyone can use that can claim to do things like, from a video call like this one, track the micro expressions in your face and assume that that is your true inner emotional state. So what is called emotion recognition AI, and things like this. I mean, I've been writing about critically for years, but they are rolling out. And I have to say, the pandemic has been an absolutely powerful driver for producing the worst type of surveillance at distance sorts of tools. And this is something that we've seen in remote work. We've seen it in remote education. These tools that claim to be able to see what people are doing, thinking and feeling, to assess their productivity, to assess whether they're cheating or not. So many forms of ultimately sort of policing in these kinds of spaces that has suddenly become economically viable. And again, the shift that we've seen just in the last 12 months. I mean, I have to be honest with you, Trevor, we saw these sorts of things coming, but the speed at which it's happened, particularly in the last year, has shocked me. I mean, it really has been a deepening of these systems to the most fine-grained, most intimate types of recording, interpretation, and surveillance. And and certainly for you, and I think about your work, you've focused to a large extent in your early years on state practices of surveillance, on things like the NSA. But we're now starting to see those tools that were once the preserve of intelligence agencies really start to come down to a municipal level, where we're starting to see those logics built into things that we use every day.
When I first met you, I had it was at a conference right after the Snowden stuff had come out, and I was given doing a panel presentation with Laura Poitras about the NSA and about state surveillance. We were like, "Oh, this is terrible," and the government is looking at your email and stuff, which is all true and is terrible. And I think even at that time you were saying, "Well, you guys got to think about Google and you got to think about Amazon." And I can't speak for Laura, but I certainly was like, "Well, Google doesn't have guns and Google doesn't have prisons, so we really need to worry about the NSA." And what if I had a hat in front of me, I'd be eating it right now, because of course Google has prisons and of course Google has guns. And in one of the chapters in the book, you're looking at data collection and artificial intelligence in ways that are analogous to the militarization of the police, perhaps, right? We're in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We see the creation of certain kinds of technologies to fight insurgencies. We see the surplus of those technologies. Those get incorporated into municipal police departments, and boom, you have a Ferguson with armored cop carriers and machine guns and stuff like that, showing up this kind of the transformation of municipal spaces into sites of warfare. And you see analogous things happening in the space of AI as well.
Exactly right. And this is something that I look at in the book in terms of a company like Palantir, which really is using kind of spy grade services, but using it to track immigrants, using it to track people who are seen as problematic because of a series of statistical relationships in terms of predictive policing. Again, I'm thinking of books like Sarah Brain's, Predict and Surveil, looking at how these tools are used by the LAPD. Again, we've seen this shift of things that used to be used in war zones, they're now being used in our communities, and oftentimes on the most vulnerable. It is extraordinary to see how quickly, again, those logics have become built into the fabric of everyday life. And, I remember that conversation, many, many years ago, we were thinking about, that there was some divide between states and large-scale tech companies. And in so many ways, they're now collaborating across the board, not just at the level of AI in the military, which is another big thing that we talk about and is in the book, but at that level of everyday collaboration, drawing those lines of distinction between these forms of power. I think it's so important that we look at them as hybrids now, and we look at the ways in which nation states are starting to take on the armature of tech companies, as tech companies have taken on the power and agency of nation states. We're really starting to see some extraordinary and problematic shifts there that I think have brought these areas of interest into much closer relationship than they were. But no, I think it's a fantastic question.
No, absolutely. And just the way that those distinctions become so collapsed. And I think it does come back to one of the ways that you talk about AI in the book. One of the overarching themes is really about power, right? And thinking about who gets to extract what kinds of information and classify it in certain kinds of ways and extract what kinds of value from it, or enhance what forms of police power, economic power, what have you. And I had certainly always thought that why wouldn't Facebook have a service that just scans all pictures of teenagers, and when it sees a picture of a teenager drinking, the police get an alert, right? Well, it turns out that was a kind of notional thing, but there are absolutely things like that going on. If we look at a Clearview or a Palantir, I remember when Trump was elected and there was all this talk about the wall, and I think you said something like, well, there already is a border wall, it's called Facebook.
I mean, it's interesting too, because of course now there was some sort of press release just a couple of weeks ago that said that there's a company that is going to be tracking using, just a camera that's often built into a lot of new cars these days. And if you appear to be angry or sleepy, that they will be sending those text alerts to local police. So yes, the interconnections of those systems into real-time monitoring and modulation, a sort of a securitization and financialization of real life, as well as a militarization of actions, with this idea of this normative idea of, what is the ideal citizen, somehow never articulated but assumed in the background. That is what we're starting to see happen very rapidly. So, how we start to think about power there, obviously power analysis, that we have many decades of philosophers and theorists who have been showing us how to think about power in different ways. But certainly with AI, what I think is important is to look at those many different forms of power. Economic power, power that comes from forms of political realignments and social realignments. Again, how we start to put this in the broader context of the planet under crisis and what this means. And so, certainly trying to look at those relationships of different forms of power and where they start to agglomerate and centralize. That is the work that is needed now, so that we can think about what a politics of refusal looks like, that we can actually start to think about, where does this end? Because, for me, doing this book, when I was thinking about, like, where does all of this money go? The tech billionaires who have profited so much, where are they spending that money? Well, we're starting to see now that they want to leave the Earth. We're starting to see the creation of a privatized space race so that the growth can continue. It's like,
it is like, I mean, the space stuff is just so obviously junk, and I would feel bad if we ended this conversation without pointing out another theme in your book, which is how much of this stuff is bullshit. Like, just how much crap, pseudoscience, nothing bullshit is so often at the core, are the core assumptions of so many technical systems. And we can talk about whether that matters or not in terms of making products or raising capital or extracting value. But over and over again, you show in the book how the foundational assumptions of so many aspects of machine learning and AI are just based on just like some crap that some engineer made up.
Well, often it goes much further than that. It really goes back into sort of theories of what it is to be a person in the world. I mean, when we're talking about emotion recognition earlier, I sort of looked back at the work of Paul Ekman, this idea that there were 6 universal emotions that we all show in our faces and can be seen, detected, and translated. That's an assumption that has been criticized ever since it was first proposed. We can go back to Margaret Mead, an anthropologist who said, we lose so much when we try to apply these narrow heuristics, these proxies for human complexity and sociality, and we try to sort of create these very simplified systems. But the reason you see those ideas perpetuate in machine learning is because it fits what these systems can do. They can operate according to a set of rules and principles, a set of proxies that stand in for complexity. And so that's what we're getting. We're getting a form of systemic and I think quite powerfully centralized control built on, I think, really, I would say, questionable foundations about how we understand each other in the world. And that is why I think, when I think about your work in space and what you've learned about why space is hard and all of these assumptions that somehow we're all going to be able to be living on rotating satellites in space, it's so worrying, because it just shows that the ideology of these systems lead us to ultimately give up on responsibility for where we live, the planet that sustains us, and to just believe that growth and endless profit must continue, even in these absolutely ridiculous ways.
Truly, delusions are everywhere. None but delusions are still powerful and can, shape societies in really intense ways, often in extremely detrimental ways. I think we should probably move on to audience questions. I mean, we could talk all night, as we have many nights, but
hello, Peter.
And we've got quite a bit here.
Wonderful.
So let's start. Could you talk more about the politics of classification? Classification could be considered violence by or replacing uniqueness of an individual with a predictable, controllable stereotype. I don't think classes are ever natural. They are constructions that exist in social political contexts.
Welcome, friend. Yes, that's exactly right. We need you, actually. We need you, particularly in the spaces where technical systems are being designed, because I just wish more people understood that. I mean, certainly for me, sort of the go-to thinkers on this have always been people like Jeff Bowker and Susan Lee Starr. I mean, in thinking of books like Sorting Things Out, those long histories of classification that have traditionally been used to control populations. We could also think of James C. Scott and Seeing Like a State. You can see, Peter, now I'm just listing all the books that people should be buying from you tonight. It's like just
exactly.
Click them. But those extraordinary histories are just being played out again. You're exactly right. Those forms of classification, who do they serve? What have they done? And what drops out? As long as we keep asking those questions and pressing against them, we can actually start to have, I think, more rigorous conversations about what's happening in the application of technical systems. But, and this is something that, again, Trevor, your work too speaks to. It's really hard now to see how a lot of these large-scale AI systems are classifying you and the world. These are not transparent systems that you can understand and engage with. It's not as though, you know, it's the same as, say, in the South African apartheid regime in the 1970s, where everybody had to carry a passbook that said which classifications of race you have been put into. These are happening in the back end of large-scale technical systems, in Facebook, in Instagram, in everything that we're using. You're not actually seeing the work of classificatory politics. And that to me is an extremely serious political concern.
So I have a question from Sejan Pike. What is the next emerging technology that you are eyeing or looking to research? And how can we, as researchers or designers of AI-driven products, be more proactive about spotting tech that could have major societal and political implications in the future?
Yeah, I mean, and we don't want to have to be in one of these kind of races of whack-a-mole where it's like, what's the next terrifying system that's about to be applied to populations? My hope is twofold. And first is that we do start to have more of a sort of horizon view of where things are going, so that we can actually start to think about responses and where we can actually say no. That just because a system can be built doesn't mean that it should be. That this idea of technological inevitability is fundamentally thrown out the window. And I'm thinking now of, you know, there are sort of moves that are happening in neuroscience, which I find, you know, incredibly disturbing. Not my field of research, but certainly something that I read and see the sort of combining of neuroscience with AI, this idea that we should upload our brains to the cloud, or that we can have systems that can scan people in order to see their, you know, their IQ and their intelligence by looking at brain scans. This might sound ridiculous. There are companies trying to do this right now. So certainly things like that really trouble me. And I do think there's a lot more we can do, but it's actually this turn that we need to make, which is to focus less on the technology and more on how do we want to be living? What sort of worlds are going to be sustainable given what we know about climate and population and a planet under stress? So that's the shift that I hope we make.
Pablo asks, was there some relationship of space and architecture in the findings from the Atlas research?
Absolutely, all through it actually. And I really love that you're putting it that way, because of course, how we think about space is actually not traditionally, and I'm thinking about, you know, lived space, inhabited space, the space of the planet. That tends to be not how we think about AI, which is this kind of abstract nowhere, this kind of non-place. How do we shift away from that to address the specific somewheres where people and institutions are making choices? That's a shift into space to sort of ground us in spaces of decision making. And that too, I think, is itself an empowering choice. It's that nothing is a given. We can actually intervene in these technical systems. We can actually make changes. So certainly in that sense, I think that move brings with it a sense of optimism and a sense of potential.
Louise asks, how do you suggest we get to a mindset of ethical curation of data sets? Can data scientists be retrained, or is it already too late?
Well, I don't believe anything is too late just yet, although it's certainly pretty urgent. Look, there's a lot of discussion about just that. And this is where I'm going to also invite you in, Trevor, because this is something that, you know, we've thought about, like, how would you make training sets differently? So there's a paper that was led by Timnit Gebru and also, you know, co-authored by people like Hannah Wallach and Hal DeMay and Jen Wortman-Bourne that I contributed to, which is this idea of data sheets for data sets. Like, how would you even start to have information about what is contained in a data set, where it came from, what are its particular skews, what are any kinds of ethical or, you know, privacy concerns around that data? Even just starting to have provenance of data would be a start. The fact that we don't have industry standards for that yet is extraordinary to me, remains extraordinary to me. But I don't think that's going to solve it. I think we're going to have to think much harder about what it is to be using kind of found objects from the internet and claim that that is a representation of the world. That shift is in itself so beset with problems and slippages. You know, that's where I think we need to do a lot more work. But But tell me what you think, Trevor, because of course you've made training sets, for your own art projects.
Yeah, no, I've made like Dadaist training sets. I mean, like in the sense that like, when you look at the history of art, in particular, you see that at no point in human history did anybody ever think that like, oh, here's a picture of an apple, that means apple, or what have you. I mean, we have these highly elliptical relationships between signifiers and signifieds, right? Between what an image of something might be and what it represents to us, with what a word might connote or what a concept connotes. And these things are constantly changing over time. And this is what a lot of work is like, a lot of human rights work is, or a lot of like political work is trying to change those definitions, to change classificatory structures, because those things often have rights attached to them, right? And have forms of political representation attached to them, what have you. So it's a complicated question. And I would kind of want to put that back to you, Kate, in the sense that I'm just thinking of another talk that was what I think is one of the primordial ideas behind Atlas. You once gave a talk that was looking at AI in relation to fascism. And what you were asking was, do fascist political structures, to what extent do they map onto the kind of technical and epistemological structures of AI systems? And so I guess to bring that question back to you, as to what extent is there a kind of hardwired politics in AI systems?
And I think this is one of the hardest questions. I tend to not believe in hardwiring, but I do tend to believe that if we trace the political economy of how much it costs to build large-scale AI systems, who can afford that, and then what sorts of systems you need to make it work, it does tend to play into the hands of already existing powerful interests. And so what does that mean? If you're already empowering the already extremely powerful, you start to create these network effects. You start to widen asymmetries of power. And so that shift, we've seen it in terms of wealth inequality just in the last 20 years, but we're also seeing it in terms of the way in which technical capacity is, again, just pouring oil on the fire of those asymmetries, those economic, information asymmetries, those asymmetries of how you can actually act in the world. So that troubles me, that if it's already benefiting existing systems of power and already amplifying them, then we've got a real problem on our hands. So, that is something that, interestingly, just in the last 2 weeks, you would have noticed that the EU just released its first proposed guidelines for regulating AI. And it's a first attempt. There's a lot of stuff in it that's not working, but you are starting to see that moment where nation states are having to say, this isn't actually working the way it should be working, and power is being put far too much into very few hands. And so that moment is starting to happen. And of course, in the US, we're a little bit behind the 8 ball there, but that is the shift that's going to need to be made, because I don't think those forms of power can be resisted purely by individuals. We need to think collectively, and it's going to also require regulation.
And I think that's why your book is such a powerful contribution to these kind of questions. It really, and the work that you've done, for over a decade, is really bringing these issues into the conversation and getting us out of this mindset like, oh, technology, it's like a tool, you can use it to build a bridge or start a war or what have you. You know what I mean? Which is obviously an asinine and an unhelpful way of thinking about how to create more just futures and what role technologies may or may not play in that. And so just thank you for the book, and thank you for all the work that you've done to really change the way that collectively, to a large extent, we think about what technology is and what role it should play in the society.
Well, can I say thank you to you, Trevor, for just being an extraordinary, a dear friend, but also an interlocutor around this project for such a long time. Books take so long to produce, but they really are these testaments of collective insight. And so it's been a real pleasure to really think through these questions with you for so long, and with so many other researchers working on these questions. I do feel like there is a moment now and an extraordinary growing literature of people who are really trying to say, we need a change. If we're going to build a more just future, we actually need to intervene now. So it's my pleasure to be here and to be part of that. And Peter, thank you for hosting us. I feel like we need to toast your very classy martini. All I have here is a bit of whiskey, but it's going to have to do.
It will suffice. This has been such a great pleasure, and I wish there were like some sort of universal channel I could just switch on and just listen to the two of you going on and on. I love it. So really, I'd like to thank you for joining us, Kate, and congratulations. I mean, this is really an amazing achievement. Thank you, Trevor. It's a pleasure again having you in our orbit. And also thank you to our friends and partners at Gray Area, also Yale University Press, Liz, we love you. We have other collaborations coming up with Gray Area and Goethe Institute in San Francisco coming up in June. There is a 3-day festival called Revision, Decoding Technological Bias. It's going to run from the 10th through the 12th. And we'll have multiple speakers. So please check that out on the Gray Area and the City Lights websites. Once again, please do purchase books tonight. It goes a long way in helping us to bring you programming like this, especially during COVID times, and we're really not out of the woods just yet. So your support is really appreciated. Tonight's event is sponsored by the City Lights Foundation. It's a 501c nonprofit carrying on the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti. I should also let you know tonight's talk is going to be rebroadcast on the Gray Area website. So if you know anyone that missed our talk, please forward the link, and you could always watch it again yourself. So thanks again, everyone. Have a safe evening. We hope to see you again soon. Please be well.
Thanks, everyone. Great to see you.